Some years ago, I was teaching, and I had a colleague who was a distributor for Christian movies and books within Canada. And one day he brought a box of DVDs to the seminary and said that we could give them out at public events for free. The DVDs featured a well-known Christian comedian doing one of his comedy acts. And I asked this gentleman, well, how come you're giving away all these DVDs? And he told the story that in this comedy act in the video, one of the jokes that the comedian made had to do with Steve Irwin. Now, I don't know if you remember, Steve Irwin was the well-known Australian crocodile hunter guy. He would often, go in to wrestle with crocodiles and with other wildlife in a very dramatic way. I think Animal Planet was his home, that channel. He was a very popular one, seemed like a wonderful guy. And so this comedian had this joke about Steve Irwin. The joke was that, well, there must be a God because Steve Irwin is still alive. So it must be that God is keeping Steve Irwin from dying in all of these extreme situations with crocodiles and with other animals. And then Steve Irwin dies in a tragic accident. I think it was with a manta ray. And suddenly that joke wasn't funny anymore. And they couldn't sell the DVDs, and so they had to give them away. Now that story, I think, is an illustration of a bigger truth. And the bigger truth is that you have to be careful about arguments for God's existence, because they may have unexpected consequences or implications. And I think here about the ending of an essay by C.S. Lewis, which has long fascinated me. The essay is called simply Christian Apologetics, and you can find it in a collection of Lewis's book writings, I should say, called Compelling Reason. And this is how Lewis ends his essay on Christian apologetics. He says, "One last word. I have found that nothing is more dangerous to one's faith than the work of an apologist. No doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as the one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on itself. As a result, when you go away from the debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar. That is why we apologists take our lives in our hands and can be saved only by falling back continually from the web of our own arguments, as from our intellectual counters, into the reality, from Christian apologetics into Christ himself. That is also why we need one another's continual help." What is Lewis exactly saying here? Well, I'm going to offer my own interpretation of Lewis's words. Think about another case. Now, I just posted another video a couple days ago, and in that other video, I talked about the challenge, the dilemma of how do you know that you're actually experiencing reality? How do you know that you're awake rather than asleep? How do you know that you're sense perceiving reality rather than being a brain in a vat or a mind in a matrix, or whether you might be deceived by an evil demon? Now, the arguments, that's the dilemma, I should say. And what philosophers have done is they've tried to propose various arguments to overcome that skeptical dilemma. They've tried to present arguments to show how we can reasonably believe, perhaps even know, that in fact we are experiencing a reality external to our minds. And so they've developed various deductive and abductive and inductive arguments. And some of those arguments are quite interesting. Some of them are ingenious. But is any one of those arguments as strong as our simple experience of reality, our sense perceptual experience? And I would say unequivocally no. There is no deductive argument I can give you for the claim that I experience a reality external to my mind, which is stronger than my basic experience of the reality of the world around me. That itself overwhelms any possible argument I could give against skepticism. But when I focus all the time on trying to develop arguments against skepticism about the external world, I could create the perception that really the primary way and I know about the external world is through these arguments. And then the arguments look relatively weak when they are compared with the overwhelming experience of sense perceptual reality itself. I believe that Lewis is arguing something similar when it comes to Christianity. Why are people Christians? Well, they're not simply Christians because they've typically had a couple good arguments for the existence of God and maybe the historical resurrection and an argument for miracles, and they kind of added it all up and said, okay, I'll be a Christian. Rather, they have a basic experience of God, of his living dynamic reality, and they have it in community. And that experience to them is stronger in terms of its production of belief than any arguments that you might propose from the apologist. So the danger then, I think Lewis is right to point out, is that while there is obviously great value in apologetics, there is also a danger that by developing arguments for God's existence, for the truth of Christianity, you might lead people to think that somehow those arguments are the basis on which this belief and experience of God rests, so that the belief and experience of God is only as strong as the arguments you can provide for it. And in fact, as Lewis, I think, rightly recognizes, that would be a very dangerous mistake. And in fact, you could potentially imperil Christian belief by creating the errant impression that it is somehow dependent on the quality of your apologetics or mine. I assure you, it is not.